Okay, friends, welcome and thank you for joining this evening's Where Are We Now and What Does It Mean for Our Movements webinar. I'm Joseph Gerson of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. And as we begin, I want to appreciate Massachusetts Peace Action's co-sponsorship of this evening's panel. Let me begin by setting our virtual table. General Milley, you will remember, warned that Trump is fascist to the core, and Milley wasn't kidding. As we turn to this new reality, I've been reminded of advice from a Swedish friend years ago. He said that in the US, you act out the first 85%, and then you think through the last 15%. In Europe, he said, we do the reverse. While we do have to act, because the situation has changed and is so dangerous, thinking together, as we will do this evening, is of the utmost importance. On November 6th, many of us woke to a new historical reality. The majority of US voters had embraced a would-be dictator and an authoritarian plutocracy. During the election, we were warned that the Trump election could signal the end of constitutional democracy. Since then, we've been shocked on a daily basis by his cabinet nominations. Earlier today on NPR, Terry Gross interviewed Marty Baron, the former editor-in-chief of the Washington Post, and David Remnick of the New Yorker. Their description of how Trump will be attacking the media and our freedom of expression was chilling. As in other countries, first they come for the press, and then we don't know what happens next. In our universities, assaults on academic freedom and students' rights are already underway. As Tom Nichols wrote, democracy is not over, but we have a lot of work to do. As you know, and as we will discuss this evening, Trump and company's first targets will be the civil service to eliminate opposition and to attack immigrants with mass deportations, along with and as part of the introduction of the military into our communities. The Justice Department, with or without Matt Gaetz, will be used to put political opponents on trial and in jail. As commander-in-chief, Trump can recall retired senior military officers back into service and court-martial those who warned of what he would bring us. There is to be a purge in the military to ensure loyalty, and the EPA is to be gutted so that the fossil fuel industry can reap still greater profits and accelerate climate emergency. Dark times and creative opposition lie ahead. If all this weren't enough, with Biden green-lighting Ukraine's use of longer-range missiles to attack Russian territory, Putin's new doctrinal line on nuclear weapons use has been crossed. Putin's initial responsibilities seem to be massive conventional responses along with more hybrid warfare. Putin, knowing that 52% of Ukrainians want an end to the war, will likely be somewhat patient, waiting for Trump's accession and Trump's pressure on Zelensky, leading to ceasefire and negotiations on better terms that have been on the table. In the Middle East, Trump advised Netanyahu to finish the job in Gaza, which promises still greater death and suffering for Palestinians, while Lebanon is being subjugated. And who knows where Trump's disdain for Iran and Musk's recent meeting with Iran's UN ambassador will lead. But Trump's greatest foreign ambition is the holy grail of the Indo-Pacific economy. Rather than pursuing common security with Beijing, he will do all that he can to contain and dominate China militarily, economically, and technologically. So we're in for some intense confrontations and dangerous confrontations with China. So even as there are continuities with the traditions of the lost cause, the robber baron era, and what Zbigniew Brzezinski once termed our imperial project, we are called upon to respond to a profound and historic change in the U.S. body politic. The challenge we face is to defend human decency, to protect democracy, human rights, and the climate, and to end and prevent catastrophic wars. This is going to require new ways of thinking, strategizing, and acting on our part. As we begin thinking our ways forward, we are very fortunate tonight to have three exceptionally informed and experienced thinkers and movement leaders to help us chart our course. Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis is Executive Director of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. She is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church and leads at teaches at Union Theological Seminary in New York. She has been organizing among poor and low-income communities for 30 years with organizations such as the National Union of the Homeless, the National Welfare Rights Union, the Coalition of Immigrant Workers, Domestic Workers United, and many more. She is the editor of We Cry for Justice, Reading the Bible with the Poor People's Campaign, and author of Always With Us, What Jesus Really Said About the Poor. She has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Newsweek, and the list goes on. Unfortunately, Liz is going to have to leave us at about 8 o'clock. So when we get to the Q&A period, I think we'll try to initially direct questions to Liz before we lose her. I have to extend a special thanks to Michael Klare, who is joining us at the last minute. Kevin Martin, who was initially scheduled to talk tonight, lost his voice. And Michael, who is one of the nation's leading foreign and military policy analysts and critics, very generously changed his evening commitments to join us. Michael is the nation's defense correspondent. He is Professor Emeritus of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College and a senior visiting fellow at the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C. Michael is also with me, the co-chair of the Committee for a Sane U.S.-China Policy. He is a regular contributor to many publications, including The Nation, Tom's Dispatch, and Mother Jones, and a frequent columnist in Foreign Policy in Focus. His books include, most recently, All Hell Breaking Loose, the Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Justice, Resource Wars, and Blood for Oil. Quite prolific. We are also fortunate to have Harris Gruman, the Executive Director of the Service Employees International Union, State Council here in Massachusetts. He is a very thoughtful organizer and union leader, and we're very happy to have him join us with us this evening. He is co-founder and co-chair of Raise Up Massachusetts, a coalition of 150 organizations, which successfully campaigned to raise the minimum wage to $15, to enact paid family and medical leave, and to pass the Fair Share Amendment, also known as the Millionaire's Tax. A veteran of decades of successful issue and electoral work in community and labor organizing, he is an astute political strategist. A former executive director of Neighbor to Neighbor Education Fund, he studied at Johns Hopkins University. He's been a speaker for 2 recent Massachusetts Progressive conferences, is an organizer of the annual Haunt Community Festival in Somerville, and is a member of Mass Peace Action's Ukraine, A Time for Peace campaign committee. Finally, before giving the floor to Reverend Theoharis, let me say a few words about our process. Each speaker will have essentially 10 minutes for introductory remarks. That will be followed by a short period in which they can question and respond to one another. Then we will move to our Q&A session. To ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom and center of your computer screen. Please do not use that space for comments, as it will interfere with our ability to find and to ask your questions. So with all of that, Reverend Theoharis, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here, and I feel really humbled and honored to be in the mix with this awesome panel of speakers. So as this dust is settling from this divisive election cycle, I want to suggest that the nation has arrived at a Kairos moment. Kairos is a moment of great change and uncertainty when old institutions, old structures of society are dying, and kind of new movements, new awakenings are struggling to be born. You know, we're on this kind of precipice of 2025. And here in these, as Maya Angelou called, yet to be United States, we're haunted by specters of war and climate crisis and economic inequality and poverty. Today, I probably don't have to remind people here, there are 140 million people, 40% of the population who are poor and low income, and 60% of the population who are living paycheck to paycheck without affordable health care or decent homes or quality education. And at the same time, we have, top leaders in our government peddling in racism and sexism, transphobia, anti-immigrant hate, and they're bringing us closer to nuclear war than we have been in my entire lifetime. Of course, not all communities have been thrusted into the same crisis before, or especially since Trump's election, although all of us will clearly die in nuclear war. Probably people saw that on November 6th, the Bloomberg Billionaire Index reported that the 10 richest men in the world, just in one day, added 64 billion to their own wealth. Excited by the profits that they're going to make with Donald Trump in the White House. Folks might also be aware that the stock market has had some of its very best days in recent history since this election result. Not to mention how military contractors and other pillars of our military industrial complex, how much they have to gain in a Trump presidency. I wouldn't be surprised, and folks here know better than I do, but if pretty soon our Pentagon budget reaches $2 trillion and we find ourselves even deeper into World War III. Nonetheless, as we heard, after inciting an insurrection at the Capitol, being indicted in both state and federal court, convicted of 34 felony counts, and using racist and sexist and hateful rhetoric, incredibly prolifically, Donald Trump has gone down in history as the only convicted felon to become an American president, receiving more than 74 million votes and, securing the 312 electoral college votes that he did to be able to become this president. But I want to say that although the victory is undisputed, the outcome relied heavily on a weakened democracy and a polarized economy, kind of drawing on discontent and disarray to regain this political power. Whether it's, since the gutting of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, there have been prolonged attacks on our right to vote, disenfranchising millions and millions of voters. And at the same time, widespread poverty and economic precarity have become a defining characteristic of our impoverished democracy. But also, we have to notice that with just over 74 million votes, compared to Harris's probably, 69, 71 million, among a voting eligible population of more than 230 million, Trump only received 1/3 of the possible votes in this election. Probably 85 million eligible voters simply chose not to turn out. And so in reality, he's not entering the office with any kind of popular mandate. And I think this is actually really important. So if we think about those tens of millions that voted for Harris, and then nearly 85 million people who didn't vote, and then actually tens of millions of people who may have voted for Trump, but also voted for reproductive rights and living wages and paid sick leave and a fair tax system and so many other things. And we think about how we're going to organize all of these people into a movement of the people from the bottom up. I think it's a more helpful framework and a more hopeful framework for us to be looking at right now. And yet we know that buoyed by a Republican-controlled Senate and a House of Representatives, Trump's second term brings with it a profound sense of dread, based on this heightened awareness of what Trump 2.0 is likely to carry forward. All of it laid bare in the Heritage Foundation's nearly 900-page pre-election Project 2025 mandate. Whether it's the mass deportations, assaults on social welfare programs and housing programs and reproductive rights and LGBTQ families and public education, we know that millions more people are likely to be thrown into deeper crisis with alarmingly less ways to resist or express dissent. Whether we look at the kind of kill nonprofit bill that is before us, even before Trump takes office, And also when we consider Trump's longstanding willingness to use military force to quell protest. And he's already started talking about overhauling Medicaid and food stamps programs that benefit at least 70 million poor and low-income people to offset the cost of extending these tax cuts to billionaires and corporations. And then this is all on top of what is happening in the Middle East with genocide of Palestinians and a war in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and beyond. So I think in the face of all of this fear, all of this attack, all of this regression, all of this reaction, we have to actually look at the kind of heroism of impacted communities who are joining together, have joined together, and are acting in these extraordinary ways of solidarity. But it's often overlooked or belittled. If we consider the wake of Hurricane Helene in Western North Carolina and the beautiful kind of mutual aid and solidarity and medics and doctors running free clinics and all of this, or we think about the powerful organizing that is still happening on hundreds of campuses for solidarity with Palestine right now. It might not be being discussed as much, but it's happening. I was with folks in Albany yesterday who were on a complete strike.
As I hate to do this, but 2-minute warning.
Yep. Not going to classes, not working, or whether it's these mass Zoom meetings and prayer services or these community actions or around kind of we're worth fighting for, calls to mobilize around peace in Palestine, around Inauguration Day and beyond. We have all of these examples of, I think, offering kind of hope in hard times. And I think it's really important that we look at how it's bottom-up movements that are the ones that kind of lead those who are compelled to organize and act, not because it's a good idea, not because it's the moral thing to do, but resisting authoritarianism out of survival. Fred Hampton talked about this as survival pending revolution. And I think this is an important frame for this moment. It's what's happened throughout history, and it's what's happening today. I really believe that the only response to times like these is to organize and organize and organize, always from the bottom up and not the top down. And we can follow the lead of those who have been living in extreme conditions, who have been abandoned amid abundance, who know what it is to be in authoritarianism, and who know and are clear that the choice between war and peace is a choice between life and death. And so, I know folks here are already engaged in things, but if you're looking for some hope in these hard times, please connect with local peace and activist groups. Please connect with the Poor People's Campaign and the Kairos Center. Please connect with Common Defense and that's organizing for peace. Please connect with showing up for racial justice and so many examples, because I believe that we're in for really hard times, but there is hope in that kind of mourning and then organizing. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that sober but also hopeful speech. And just to appreciate that many people have been in different countries, have been through very hard times, and everything changes. But it takes our shoulders and our minds and our efforts to get there. So I want to turn then to Harris Gruman, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you, Reverend. It's great to have you say so many of the things that need to be said, and I don't need to say them as a result. But when we're faced with a crisis of this kind, I think it's very important to take a big view of history, because this is a crisis. This is the biggest crisis I think I've seen in my lifetime in American politics. And so, we need the big view to keep ourselves grounded and situated. So let me go take a really big view and say, I feel we're really in the middle of a 250-year historical experiment, a really amazing historical experiment that I call the Great Democratic Revolution. And its goal is to create the most equality possible, humanly possible, among humanity. I feel it's sort of inaugurated at its highest, original point with the 1789 pamphlet by the Abbe Sieyès that said, "What is the third estate?" And that was opposed to like the first estate of nobles and the second estate of bishops and so on, not reverends like our previous speaker, but the big hierarchy. And he said the answer is everyone. And for a couple short years, that was true. For a couple short years, that movement involved Black slaves in Haiti, what is today Haiti. It involved women working in sweatshops in Paris. It involved peasants on great estates in all across France. It involved armament manufacturing workers in Amiens, France. I mean, it was a really amazing thing, short-lived as it was. Where are we in that experiment now? I mean, I would say, given horrific ups and downs and backs and forths over the decades and even centuries, I think this experiment hit its high watermark in the mid 20th century. The New Deal and the defeat of fascism worldwide ushered in what people at the time called the century of the common man. And there was some reality to that. Pardon the genderness of it, but there was some reality to that because for the first time in history, two generations, for the first time in history, my generation and my parents' generation, it was more important what you studied and did for work than whose child you were or who you married. That had not been true for 5,000 years. And it is no longer probably true right now. One of its greatest achievements, to give a sense of what this means in concrete terms, was that the Rehn-Meidner plan in Sweden, the social democracy in Sweden, eliminated health disparities between children in the top 5% income bracket and children in the bottom percent income bracket. An incredible accomplishment. And all of this opened the door to the first real engagement and long-term engagement with racial equality and gender equality. Unfortunately, in the 1970s, this progress came under a very severe attack, and we have experienced steady reversals since that time. Now, in that post-war period up till today, something intruded for the first time in this experiment, and that was the very question of human survival. Draw your attention to Mikhail Gorbachev's historic 1988 speech to the United Nations, where he shocked everyone by saying the Cold War was about competing views of the democratic revolution that started in 1789. He said, we have to put those on hold to deal with human survival. What do I mean? Nuclear annihilation, as the Reverend said, and ecosystem collapse. In 1988, he announced that to the world. Brilliant, but it put people like myself in the labor movement, for example, or people who work on things like the Poor People's Campaign, in a kind of a odd chicken and egg paradox situation, which is how do you work on equality and human survival at the same time? For this reason, working people, struggling working people, and I would say that's like the people in the bottom, below the median income in US and Europe, or most of the people in the global South, their view of this problem of global human survival is blocked by the immediate problem of economic survival in their lives. So the question is, like you go back to what I was talking about before, the high watermark, there was a moment there where you could put these things together. The period I like to call Utopia 1966. That was the moment where you could actually bring together these movements because people felt their economic situation and their equality was being fought for. And now that that's not the case, we got a big problem. We don't have time to rebuild that level of egalitarianism and then work on human survival. We don't have that luxury anymore. And so clearly, we have to work on both at the same time. Now, I would say that the broad left has kind of failed in this mission in recent decades. We had a great opening in 2009 to do this. Occupy handed us a beautiful slogan, the 99% and the 1%. Everywhere I went, community college classrooms, union halls, Democratic town meetings, when I would say, do you know what I mean by the 99% and the 1%? And everyone said yes, and they were angry about it, and they wanted to do something about it. And I can, the examples that were given in the introduction of me about Raise Up Massachusetts happened because of that slogan. We rode that slogan to, doing a constitutional amendment for a millionaire's tax, the first progressive income tax in Massachusetts in 115 years, doubled the minimum wage, raised it to the highest level it has ever been in value, and created a Scandinavian quality system of paid family and medical leave in this one state. But what happened is all of that became squelched by what developed as the big cultural war between Trump and what I would call the sort of ultra-liberal neoliberals. And we let ourselves get dragged into that, and we became also divide and conquer folks, because they were trying to divide and conquer the 99%. And they did a damn good job, and we facilitated it. And so I think we had a wonderful second chance in Biden's Build Back Better that he inaugurated in 2021. And Build Back Better really was addressing equality and human survival at the same time. And you might say, well, how's that? It did it under cover of the human equality question, not the human survival question, in the form of, central to it was a $500 billion investment in direct care work, like child care, home care, mental health and substance abuse care. And how does that pull those things together? First, it would have put millions of the lowest paid workers in the United States on the path to the middle class. It raised standards, training, everything for that. And at the same time, serve the rest of the working class as families, working families struggling to get by, who need childcare, health care, et cetera. Second, it shifted the balance between Medicare, or what I call Medicaid, and the military, the two M's, Medicaid and the military, which is where the main federal budget is divided.
Harris, I hate to do this again, but 2 minutes.
Fair enough. It shifted it dramatically in favor of the Medicaid side. And by the Medicaid, of course, I'm including child care and other human care things. That was a dramatic shift if it had happened. And the third is it would have built a truly green economy, because human care work is the only truly green jobs. They don't require automation, they don't require thermal energy, whether green or fossil fuels. And the problem, this was all temporarily derailed by two senators, you probably remember, Manchin and Sinema. We thought that was temporary, but then the administration pivoted dramatically at the end of that year, the end of the first year, to focusing on a top-down industry subsidy approach to jobs and green economy stuff, and a much more dire, a new global Cold War with Russia, China, and Iran. Now, the results of this administration have been devastating. No progress on reducing inequality, no progress on dealing with, stopping or slowing ecosystem collapse, and a big step backward on militarism, resulting, as the Reverend said, in the greatest risk of nuclear war ever in history. So where do we go from here? I mean, I think the sweeping Trump victory, and I agree it's not as sweeping as it might look, but it's way more sweeping than I expected, exposes this failure and will accelerate it greatly. I mean, it's just a doubling down on everything wrong. So, I mean, I think we have to be laser focused on our priorities, reducing economic inequality for everyone, the third estate, the 99%, and saving humanity from nuclear catastrophe and ecosystem collapse. So, the program is a New Deal, steeply progressive taxes, unions for all, universal social insurance, and survival, diplomacy, not war, nuclear disarmament, and the reduction of thermal energy use. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harris. I look forward to seeing that as an article in several publications. Very helpful contribution. Michael, you are on. You're still muted. Muted.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. And I'm thrilled to be with my co-panelists tonight. As Joseph indicated, I stepped in at the last minute. So what I have is a little bit to say is a little bit tentative. And anyway, it's still early in the game in dealing with Trump's foreign policy and military policy. There's a lot that we don't know. So what I'm going to give you is my initial assessment of what I see. It's not a final assessment, and I'll be keen to see what people say afterwards, and where you challenge me and where you think we need to know more. So let me begin. What I would start with is that we're seeing a profound shift in the underlying ethos of American foreign policy, from a ethos based on U.S. leadership of a global network of supposedly democratic, anti-authoritarian countries, to a more economically driven, mercantilist foreign policy aimed at enhancing America's economic wealth and, of course, the wealth of its richest citizens. The leadership model of U.S. foreign policy, which President Biden sought to rehabilitate after Trump's first term in office, had been the dominant strain in U.S. foreign policy thinking since the onset of the Cold War, and largely enjoyed bipartisan support all that time. In fact, it was usually referred to as the bipartisan foreign policy. Under Biden, this largely meant encircling China, Iran, and Russia with U.S. armed coalition partners. The NATO countries, first of all, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, India, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, most of all. This was largely a geopolitical strategy of containment, intended to preserve continued U.S. global dominance, but was given an ideological overlay as a coalition devoted to preserving a liberal, rules-based, rules-abiding world order. For Biden and company, China was or is the #1 challenger to this US-dominated world order, the only country with the capacity to overtake the US as the world's dominant power. So containing China's rise became the #1 goal of US foreign policy under President Biden. This meant bolstering US military ties with the countries surrounding China and bolstering US forces in the region. Russia figured in this equation as China's top military ally, so blunting Russia's advance into Ukraine became a top priority in the administration, but as part of an anti-China stance most of all. Many in Washington also despised Putin's dictatorial regime and sympathized with Ukraine's heroic resistance to the Russian invasion. But stopping China, not Russia, was the administration's priority. In Biden's mind, Israel also played an important role in this grand scheme as a key partner in efforts to weaken Iran, a key ally of both China and Russia. Biden sought to include Israel in the web of democratic, rules-abiding, anti-authoritarian states in his mind. But that effort crashed and burned when Israel began to decimate Gaza, extinguishing any notion of Israel as a democratic, rules-abiding state. Biden's support for Israel also sabotaged his efforts to integrate the Gulf monarchies into his global alliance system, putting U.S. efforts to isolate Iran at risk. So where do things stand now, with Biden and his co-believers about to leave office? There are no easy answers to this in my mind, as Trump's statements and those of his advisors often contradict one another. Indeed, this lack of coherence is likely to prove an abiding feature of the second Trump presidency and deserves our close attention. If we go to his campaign statements, Trump seeks to dissolve as much as possible America's global leadership role and focus instead on advancing America's economic interests by forcing allies and adversaries alike into favorable trade deals with the US. As Marcos Rubio put it on November 6th, responsible American foreign policy must be based not on idealistic fantasies, but on pragmatic decisions that prioritize the core national interests of the United States. I think that's a good summary of the Trump foreign policy outlook. In theory, this could lead to less international conflict as allies and adversaries alike seek economic advantage in a mercantilist world order rather than fight over obsolete ideological precepts. That's the good way of looking at it. But this overlooks the fact that Trump and his entourage themselves cling to rigid ideological beliefs, many which clash with one another. Looking at the Middle East, for example, Trump and his inner circle would probably favor a world in which Israel is triumphant in its wars against Hamas and Hezbollah, and which the clerical regime in Iran is brought down by internal forces over the economic suffering there caused by the tougher sanctions that Trump will impose. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE join with Israel and the US in a new NATO-like anti-Iranian alliance in the Middle East. But these are inherently contradictory outcomes. Empowering Israel to destroy Gaza, crush Hezbollah, and seize essential control over the West Bank, as advocated by many of Trump's close circle, will make a US-Saudi-Israel alliance nearly impossible. And more Israeli strikes on Iran could trigger a wider war in the Middle East, dragging the US into another foreign war of the sort that Trump has promised to avoid. Similarly, with regard to Ukraine, there are some in the Trump entourage, including perhaps Trump himself, who favor sacrificing Ukraine in order to establish a new alliance of convenience with Russia, seeking vast economic opportunities there, and one might say a common autocratic white Christian anti-gay world outlook of the sort advocated by Trump's pal Viktor Orban of Hungary. Needless to say, NATO cohesion goes out the window in this scenario.
Michael, again, I'm sorry with the 2-minute warning.
Okay. With regards to China, Trump's appointees for Secretary of State and so on have all voiced their antipathy to the Chinese leadership and have called for tough measures, including tariffs to crush China's rise, prevent China's rise. This will no doubt inflict economic harm on China, but is also likely to inflict economic harm on US corporations and consumers, slowing the economy and hurting Trump's Wall Street backers. Will they push back against this? We will have to see. Divisions also exist over Taiwan and US military moves versus China. Many in Taiwan, in Trump's circle, would like to provide further aid to Taiwan and beef up US support for Taiwan. This would increase tensions with China, perhaps to the breaking point. But this would conflict with Trump's desire to reduce US military commitments abroad and avoid involvement in foreign wars. So it's very unclear how this will play out. So to finish, as I see it, Trump's foreign policy will be shaped by the outcome of these clashing policy views between business-friendly pragmatists and ideologues in Trump's inner circle. And we have to watch this very closely and put our pressure where we can to avoid the worst possible outcomes on these issues, and try to avoid, as Harris said before, and the Reverend before that, avoid sinking into a nuclear catastrophe. I'll stop there.
Michael, thank you. And I think that it helped to be framing our thinking as our movements go forward. I want to give our speakers maybe about up to 10 minutes to kind of ask questions or push back on one another. If you don't want to go there, we can move into Q&A, but I wanted to give you a chance to have a bit of conversation among yourselves. I think we get to move to Q&A since you were all racing to raise questions there. So let me see what we have here. Just looking to see if there's one for Reverend Theoharis early on here. Well, maybe here's one. Could you comment on the fact that the End of Times group supports Trump and the fact that the president of COP29 stated fossil fuel is a gift from God?
I think it's really important for us to actually take very seriously the rise and power of white Christian nationalism. And if we're going to look at something like Project 2025 and a bunch of the policies that are threatened to be enacted, if we don't actually see this strength, this pillar of extremist Christianity, and how, whether it was with Mike Johnson becoming the Speaker of the House, an avowed, open white Christian nationalist, or indeed many people that are in these positions of power and influence who are climate deniers, who do think we're getting closer to kind of that by getting closer to the end of the world, we're getting closer to the coming of Jesus. There are many who believe these ideas, but it's also a political movement that is kind of cloaking itself in the garb of religiosity, but really for the kind of power and gain of the kind of rich and kind of powerful. And so, I mean, I think I appreciate us kind of, pointing that out, that in fact, despite the fact that Trump and many of his appointees are counter to the biggest teachings in the Bible. I think about something like Isaiah 10, woe to you who, legislate evil, who deprive the poor of their rights, making women and homeless children their prey. Or I think about Jeremiah and, do no harm to the immigrant, to the children, and don't shed innocent blood, right? Or I think about, all of these passages, and it's not proof texting, it's an arc that is actually talking about, justice and peace and love. And yet we have more and more influential politicians these days who support the likes of Trump, and the white Christian nationalists have really taken over one of our two parties. I want to let Harris jump in because I saw your hand go up.
Well, I think there's an interesting thing raised by this question about the religiosity and so on, and also this label that, I know Joseph likes to use a lot too, the white Christian nationalist, which is a thing. I'm not denying that at all, but it's a dangerous thing in some ways to label a group like that because, of course, if we have a program at SEIU called the Conservative Members Program, where we actually do a lot of very interesting focus groups with our members to figure out why some of them are very conservative, right? And what we found is, you take those three words, white, Christian, nationalism. Okay, white does imply some kind of racial, white supremacy, but again, most people in a large block of Americans are white, and so you're labeling them, and then you have Christian. Now, look, I'm a white atheist internationalist, but that's not how I present myself to my members, most of whom, by the way, are black and brown, not white, and most of whom are women. But they too, and this is the very interesting thing, when we did these focus groups, people like me, yeah, we were like clearly crazy leftists, but our black and brown members who are quite progressive in many ways, so that from they're perfect Poor People's Campaign supporters, are see themselves as Christians and as nationalists in the sense of patriots, very patriotic. And so most people in this country, most working people in this country see themselves as, whatever their race, and this is why I think we're losing ground with Latinos particularly, which is really upsetting to us as a union because that's a large part of our membership, is because they see themselves as Christian and patriotic, and we're telling them, well, that's the enemy. So labels are a very dangerous thing here. That's why I emphasize things like, what is the third estate or the 99%? I think at moments like that, we really cohere much better with people, and we give them that opportunity to not play to their worst instincts, but to play to their best instincts. And that, I just put that out there because I think that's a terrible error we have made, and why part of the reason why we're in this bind we're in. We have not taken advantage of our appeal to universal human values, and human survival, both, and equality, by basically saying large blocks of people we don't like. Just like they say large blocks of people they don't like. It becomes a reciprocal thing for understandable reasons, but it's this election to me is a wake-up call, if there ever was one.
So just to say, I'm glad we've got 170 people on the call at the moment, and we've had this kind of exchange because this is what we need as we go forward. I want to get one more question in here to Reverend Theoharis before we lose her. A question from Michael Ramos. What are lessons from the Poor People's Campaign in intersectional movement that could be applied for national and local organizing?
Yeah, thanks for that. And maybe it's a little bit also in response to this point that you were making, Harris. I very much appreciate this question about, how we label. And I also need us to be very clear that the kind of religious extremism of that has become very dominant. There's almost an equal sign between religion or Christianity and the transphobia, anti-immigrant, that's partially because progressive folk, including progressive religious folk, have conceded religion to something that actually isn't Christianity at all. And to be honest, I think that that's a place where the Poor People's Campaign and some of the organizing we're doing on a state and a local and national level comes in, because we're talking about a moral revolution of values. We're talking about the real issues that impact 140 million people. We're building bridges between communities that are impacted, having people come together, not just kind of cursing the darkness, but shining a light on some of the programs and policies we've been talking about here, whether it's the connection between healthcare and living wages and a peace economy, right? And I think that many of the best lessons are that you can pull people together across all of these lines that are dividing us, and people are ready. They're at the ready. They're to come together, and again, not just to fight back and against, but to fight for something, and not just to be mobilized, but to be organized, and not just to like stay in our silos, but to see the interconnections between the issues that are impacting folks, and to see that we can and must take leadership from those that are on the front lines, who are, those in pain know when their pain is relieved. Those who would be free must strike the first blow, in the words of someone like Frederick Douglass, right? And so I think, there's tons of lessons, and we could go on all evening. But it's kind of organize, and organize across these lines, and out of our silos.
Thank you, Liz. I'm sorry we're going to be losing you here, but I look forward to the ways that we keep in dialogue with you, and with those in our constituency. So thank you very much. I'm going to ask Michael a question here, from David Keppel, who's a quite thoughtful man whose letters we occasionally see in the New York Times. He says, is there a significant constitutional opposition to Trump's fascism in the U.S. military? If so, what does it mean for us?
I think opposition is too strong a word. I think there is a historic, deeply embedded commitment of the military to honor the Constitution, and soldiers, officers swear an oath to protect the Constitution of the United States, and they are taught from the get-go that to obey the laws and to obey the Constitution. So they have problems, or there is a potential clash between the professional military class, as it is, and the Trump administration over many issues. And this will probably be the most interesting division we will watch, because one of the issues is whether the military can be mobilized, as has been said, to round up undocumented immigrants and put them into, they're calling camps. We could add the word concentration in front of them, of that word, camps, and to deport them on a large scale, and to use the military to go on to, say, college campuses and shoot student protesters, or Black Lives Matter protests. This is the aim of the Trump administration, to use the military to suppress dissent and to conduct the expulsion of 15 million people in this country. This is not what the military officer class signed up to do or believe is their duty. They believe their duty is to defend the United States against its foreign enemies, especially China. And that's what they do 24/7. So there is going to be a potential clash over this. So for that reason, the Trump plan calls for firing officers who refuse to obey Trump's orders. And how the military, the historic military leadership will respond, retired officers and current officers will respond to this, will be the real test of how far into dictatorship the United States has fallen. One of the goals, for example, of the Trump circle is to fire the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. whose name slips my mind for the minute, was there a minute ago, who is African American, honored soldier, an Air Force general, who expressed sympathy. That's even too strong a word. Who expressed understanding of the Black Lives protests, saying that he had experienced racism in his life, as have no doubt a large percentage of the African Americans who serve in the military. It's I forget the percentage, but it's a very large percentage. So the aim is to C.Q. Brown, I think that's his name. If they fire him, if they succeed at this, that's going to be because of that will mean turning back 50 years, 70 years of efforts by the military to become more democratic, to be more diverse, to allow non-white people of color to rise to positions of leadership. And you could see here the beginning of a struggle over the military, whether it's going to perform its historic duties or be converted into an instrument of white supremacy.
Michael, thank you for that. I want to go to Harris with a question from John Rappy up in Maine. He says, Trump and company are likely to throw disasters at us at greater speed and volume than in its first term, a case of flooding the zone. I remember the saying that speed kills. How are we to cope without altogether disorienting and confusing ourselves under this wave?
Well, I mean, I wish I could answer that as succinctly as maybe I presented some of these other ideas. That's very much the case, I think. And, I think the biggest example of that, the most shocking one, is this question of deporting millions of immigrants, which, as Michael said, is a terrifying idea and has terrifying precedents in other countries, and to some extent in this country. And so, that right there is a showstopper, right? I mean, what are we going to do about that? And then you have the question of what's going to happen to organized labor, which I'm part of, or to our nonprofit sector, et cetera, or as you said, the press, the university, everybody is facing a crisis situation. And it's true. I think that's why I said, in a sense, I wanted to get a big historical sense of where we're at and what we are doing, not because that answers that question, but because at least we know that has happened in the past. There have been terrible setbacks in the past, like the Civil War and the Jim Crow and fascism in Europe, and you name it. There have been terrible. I mean, even the revolution I was citing, 1789, was completely reversed for many, many years, and it wasn't the end. It was just a terrible time for people who had hopes. So, I don't know how we deal with all that while trying to put forward what I was suggesting, which is a positive program, right? Something that would show that we actually are a rallying point. And, I think the Reverend, too, also put forward versions of that positive program. It's going to be very hard because we're going to be very reactive. And being reactive, a hard defense. It's not a easy winning situation. So I think they're creating a strategy for themselves that was pretty effective in the first term, could be much more devastating this time with a bigger mandate and a lot of experience under their belts.
A question from Michael, and then I'm going to throw one myself here. From Julie Beard. Michael, can you please say why the current disaster in Gaza and the West Bank makes it less likely for Saudi Arabia and the U.S. to have a less confrontational relationship?
Could you say that again?
So the question is, why is the current disaster in Gaza and the West Bank make it less likely that Saudi Arabia and the U.S. will have a less confrontational, or one might say, might intervene with the creation of a formal alliance. How do you see that playing out?
Well, the U.S. Start again. Israel and Saudi Arabia were very close to a U.S.-sponsored deal to form to agree to have diplomatic relations and to join in this U.S.-sponsored military alliance against Iran. That was under Trump 1. And he worked very hard on it as part of the Abraham Accords. The Saudis weren't ready yet because they have demands from the U.S., including, a military security pact and nuclear technology that ultimately would allow them to make nuclear weapons, conceivably. So it wasn't, they didn't clinch the deal. And Biden tried to continue this effort, and they were moving along, trying to overcome the obstacles, especially the nuclear dimension of it. And now Gaza broke out October 7th first, and then Gaza occurred. And we have stepped up attacks on the West Bank, increased settlements, greater violence against Palestinians. And the Saudis have said that we cannot agree to any deal with Israel without Israel accepting the creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and in Gaza. They say this is a minimum requirement for any Saudi-Israeli recognition, diplomatic recognition, or any closer relations. So, so long as Netanyahu is in power and continues this far-right campaign to seize all of the lands that they believe belong to Israel, it's impossible for the Saudi leadership, I believe, they've said this, to have any kind of relationship with Israel. And that makes it impossible for the U.S. to create that kind of alliance.
Well, Michael, could I ask something to follow up to that?
Yeah.
It did seem to me that, there was a sequence of events that was quite striking where China actually intervened in the Middle East in a way we had not seen before, where they were brokering relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran over the Yemen crisis, to try and put that to rest. And the United States seemed to me to be very agitated about that. And that's when Biden came out with a renewal, very explicit and public renewal of the desire to have an Israeli, Saudi, American kind of alliance as a kind of alternative to China's influence there, which their influence, at least on the surface, appeared to be about peace, whereas this one was more of a military alliance. And then October 7th happened. And it seemed to me that, you wonder to what extent October 7th is a kind of reaction to the idea that they're about to be completely sidelined by unity between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States, that the Palestinians are, whether that's being driven from Iran or from Palestine, the Palestinian Hamas and so on themselves. It seemed to me that was a kind of an emergency situation that led to this explosion, which actually functionally did derail that kind of alliance. But it does show that this desire to have a kind of global alliance, like a global Cold War alliance all over the world by the United States, is very likely to set off very dangerous situations. Because I also see the Ukraine thing as very much driven by the NATO expansion, although I know there are different opinions about that. But I saw that unfolding in real time and felt that clearly was a moment we could have at least stalled out, an invasion by saying, okay, we're not going to do that. So this drive to have, also in the South China Sea and with the allies like Japan down to Australia and Philippines, is all very calculated, it seems to me, to heighten tensions rather than reduce them.
Well, you said a lot and brought up different things to which I could speak. Ukraine and
I guess
China and the Middle East.
Yeah.
And a lot of what you're saying is the Biden administration, and that's what makes this conversation, for me, so difficult in talking about Trump, as I tried to say earlier, which is I think you're absolutely right that Biden, which is what I said in my comments, that Biden tried to create this grand anti-China alliance system, like, you know, a NATO that stretched to the Middle East and then around to India, and then, as you say, around to the Philippines and Australia and Japan. That is the Biden strategy, and he's still at it today. The Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, today it was at an island in the South China Sea, 200 miles from the Philippines, saying we're gonna guarantee U.S. support for the Philippines if it comes into a clash with China over these disputed islands in the South China Sea. In my mind, that's a recipe for World War III. That's today that happened. And continuing promises by the Biden administration to build up those military alliances. So coming back to your question or your point about Gaza and the rest, I think no doubt the leaders of Hamas had multiple reasons for what happened on October 7th. From what we know, that was planned long before the specific negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, with Biden shepherding all of that. And I think it represented just general despair over the promise of there being a Palestinian state ever. Just deep despair about that prompted it, rather than any specific events.
So, thank you. I want to kind of address a question with a bit of a contradiction here. You know, I had the rare privilege of working with some people who engaged in nonviolent opposition to Nazi occupations, and worked with other people in a variety of countries where it's been a long struggle. And I think we face a situation where we have immediate threats that we need to respond to, lives to protect, and at the same time recognizing that this is not going to be something over quick and easy. You know, this reflected something quite deep in the American political culture. And so I guess my question is, what do you think in terms of how we balance, how we strategize in terms of the immediate and in the deeper process of changing what our political culture has become?
Well, why don't you please start? I'll add some comments.
He's done a little tweaking of the previous question that I answered a little vaguely, and he's saying now answered a little more specifically, which is fine, fair enough. And this was helpful, actually. I do think, you know, that's what I'm working with right now with my, you know, my colleagues, you know, because I mean, I do have 120,000 SEIU members just in the state of Massachusetts. So we are a force of a kind, and we just won a ballot question to allow us to organize 50,000 Uber drivers into our union. So that's, you know, that's big stuff. So there's it's a couple of very positive, you know, things that I think convey what I was talking about in more specific terms, like the fight, you know, one fight will be that we need unions for all, right? So, you know, we're fighting for a union with Uber or with Amazon or with Starbucks, these companies that get away with this stuff, at the same time asking those companies to pay their fair share of taxes, which they do not do. They pay very low taxes in Massachusetts, if no taxes at all in some cases. And so, you know, we have this positive program that I think a majority of people would respond to. At the same time, we are put in a position where we have to defend our values. Again, with immigrants, you know, a lot of our members are immigrants, and a fair number are, you know, have difficult status problems. But they do hard work, and they are union members, and they're contributing to society. So how do we defend them without coming under the accusation that, you see, they only care about other people. They don't care about American workers. They don't care about, the accusations that are used against the left and liberals and so on. So we're in a very difficult situation, one that I think is more difficult than in some ways other ones historically that were horrific, but they were clearer. The unity was clearer. Here, we have to make up for a bad reputation we have at the same time that we have to prove that we are who we say we are. At the same time, we have to defend the people who are in danger of their lives, frankly. And if they're in danger, we're all in danger. So how do we sort of like that human survival and equality together? Well, here, even within the equality situation, we have to find a way to unify our demands for, the 99% and the demands to not oppress, minorities who are vulnerable. And that's going to be a very difficult thing to thread, but that is the challenge in front of us. So we are talking about that. Today at the State Council, we talked about, fighting for direct care workers, fighting for Uber drivers, and defending immigrants from deportation. So I don't know how that's going to unfold, but I'm saying, yeah, they've turned a fire hose on us, and we have to respond to it without being just plastered to the wall, which is what they would like to do to us. And to make up for the deficit, because like I said, the Biden administration years left us with a big deficit. When Kamala Harris said, "Let's turn the page," I kept thinking, but you are the page. Turn yourself. The problem is we didn't deliver on what we could have delivered, and so we're making up for a big deficit here and being attacked frontal assault. So, yeah, we have to keep our heads. We have to do what we can do. But I do think we have to do the positive campaign too. We can't just be on the defensive. We have to say we've been for this and we are for this. The people who broke this, I think this is a key thing. When you talk about white Christian nationalists, and the reason I sort of objected to it, the people who broke this economy and are really backing Trump, and they back Biden in his bad side too, is the billionaires, right? The oligarchs. Especially the real oligarchs, the political capitalists like Musk and Bezos, and the kind of equivalent of the Russian political capitalists, right? These are people who don't pay taxes. They get all kinds of government contracts and things. They're treated in a different way. They're not true capitalists. Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek former left-wing economics minister, called them techno-feudalists. Uber are techno-feudalists, right? All they do, they're just standing there collecting rent from all these people without just because they control apps and communications technology, a lot of which they set up, according to Yanis Varoufakis anyway, with bailout money from the great financial crisis that they sucked up and then put into monopolizing basically commerce, transportation, etc., communications. And so, those are the people we should be. I don't want to focus people on the white Christian nationalists. I want to focus people on the 1%. And, the 1% is even, kind of too low a bar. We're talking about the 0.01%. But those are, look where Musk is in this outfit. Look what Bezos did for Trump in the election. These guys either equivocate or come all out for it. And a lot of them are the same people who profiteered under Biden's, drive for militarism and, as arms dealers and all these people, fossil fuel people, the fracking industry. They're now, like, oh, well, we got, we had Biden. He was pretty good to us because of the whole Russian thing and everything. And now we got somebody who's totally good to us. They're all behind all the stuff we don't like, whether it's done by our people or done by the enemy. And so I think we need to really focus people on that. Who broke this economy for you? Who broke the economy that used to be, the utopia 1966 I was talking about?
Michael?
So, my thoughts are not disagreeing with anything Harris said at all, just a different perspective. And I'm looking mainly at foreign policy and military policy, which is what I know about. My advice is is to to engage in sober thinking, sober analysis, and look at this phenomenon carefully and see not only the threats that it poses to all of us, but its internal divisions and contradictions, because I think that's the way that we have any chance of accomplishing anything is by exploiting differences within the Trump universe that favor us. Let me just for example, who is the peace candidate in 2024? It was not Kamala Harris. It was Donald Trump. Many voters voted for him because they thought he was the peace candidate. He railed against the military-industrial complex at times. He said, "I'm going to get you out of wars, and I'm the peace guy." And you know, his voters look to him for that. So we should hold him to the fire on that. You're the peace guy. Bring us peace, and identify those in his circle who are undermining his promises to his voters, as an example. And there are many other instances of that. He's expressed doubts about whether the U.S. should go to war over Taiwan. That's good. We should encourage his doubts, and expose those around him who would plunge the U.S. into another war. He doesn't. I mean, he claims he doesn't want another war. War isn't good for business outside of the military-industrial complex. But for most Americans, for most people, most companies, a war in Asia will be catastrophic. It'll destroy the prosperity that we've enjoyed for decades and decades because there's been peace in Asia. I'm talking hypothetically. You understand, but we have to think strategically in that sense, I think.
No, I agree. Although you gave me an uncanny flashback to George W. Bush debating Al Gore in the election back then, and he's chastising Al Gore for the Clinton administration being policemen of the world, and he's like, "You won't get. I'm not for that. I'm for like no military intervention." And
Well, I'm just saying, rather than chastising everybody who voted for Trump, everybody in the Trump circle, that's not going to get us very far at this point in time, I don't think.
That's part of my point too, is that I don't want to chastise the Trump voter per
Yeah.
se, particularly the Latino, white, and Black working class voters who, however we feel they were tricked or whatever, we can't write them off as like a bunch of, deluded Nazis or something, because, then we're not going to regain that ground.
So one of the issues that we're going to have to, that is, those of us who are not in the military and historically have opposed militarism in this country. Remember, there was a prior question, Joseph, you have to remind me the name of the person who raised that, about the stance of the U.S. military. It may be that our survival as a democracy is going to depend on military officers,
Right.
that they stand up to Trump and say, "I'm not going to carry out illegal orders," and that run against the Constitution. And we may be called upon to support those generals and admirals who speak up in that fashion, something that's not part of our normal toolkit, as it were. But
Michael, over the years, I've become a Leninist, as in John Lennon, that life is what happens when you're making other plans. And clearly, our first priority has got to be to do what we can to preserve democracy.
Yeah,
and not to sacrifice the good for the perfect. And as you said, I think this is a time, and as I tried to frame as we began, it's a time for in addition to action, to some really sober thinking. And I want, I guess, to close out at this point, but to thank you both for helping to start at least this part of the conversation. I know everybody's involved in conversations in many directions, and to say that I'm looking forward to our continued both conversations, but also our collaborations. And so a very, very sincere thank you to each of you, to our audience, and people will have seen the name Mariana Fernandez on your screen. Mariana has been the wonderful woman who has made our technology work, and to whom we are greatly indebted. And just then to encourage those of you with 130 who are still with us here, to dig deeper, to pursue truth, and to pursue human democracy, human solidarity, and truth. Thank you very much. Good night.
good night, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Joseph.